Good day, and welcome to Lightning Commercial EV Talk, Lightning eMotors podcast on the electric vehicle market. My name is Colin Wilhelm. I'm the Funding and Policy Manager here at Lightning eMotors. And with me today, I'm joined by our CEO, Tim Reeser.
Great to be here, Colin.
Great to have you. Lightning EV Talk is a forum that brings together thought leaders and EV leaders from both inside Lightning Motors and outside. And with that, we like to bring in a discussion and contribution to what's going on in the electric vehicle world. I'll start off by giving a brief introduction of Lightning eMotors, and then we'll move into today's exciting topic. Lightning eMotors is based in Loveland, Colorado, where we provide a complete fleet electrification solution for Class 3 through Class 5 customers. We do this with vans, cargo transportation, ambulances, school buses, shuttle buses, and we even repower some larger transit buses. We also provide charging equipment and installation services, along with comprehensive vehicle charging telematics to monitor these vehicles while they're on the road. One thing that I'm really proud of working on as the funding manager is helping our clients find funding solutions and sources. And that's actually what we're actually going to be talking a little bit about today in the new environment. Our near 250,000 square foot manufacturing facility is all done here in Loveland, Colorado, which is really awesome because we employ American jobs in America for American fleets right now. And we might have some expansion later on in the future, but it's really America-focused, America-based right now, which I think is a great opportunity for us. So now with that out of the way, I think we can turn to our discussion, which is why we have our CEO Tim here today, on the exciting news that came out with the Inflation Reduction Act. So, Tim, as we all know that you have your ear to the ground in the electric fleet world, and you're right there on the pulse of everything. But how surprised were you in July when the Inflation Reduction Act came down? Not just in the speed it came down, but also in the size, the scope, the versatility of it, and where it might lead for the future of the market.
It's a great question, Colin, and I was very surprised, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously, we'd had Senator Hickenlooper's office out here, as well as other key politicians who had been part of the program. And so we'd had a chance to kind of make our case on the importance of commercial vehicles to electrification, the importance of the ecosystem around how do we electrify commercial vehicles. So we felt like we'd made the case, but as we all know, lawmaking is quite a stew process. And so how it was going to turn out and how the soup was going to end up when we were done was anybody's guess. And so I wasn't optimistic that it would be as advantageous to us. And when I saw it, and as you and I dug into it, and outside counsel dug into it, and as we got with Senator Hickenlooper's office to get their interpretation, I was pleasantly surprised at how much of it certainly fit well in commercial vehicles and fit well with what we do. Because certainly we think this will be a key driver in terms of driving commercial vehicles towards electrification. We had spent a lot of time and felt that, things like how do we drive school buses and transit buses were important to our customers, and an important change. Historically, the federal government hadn't really been involved, for example, in school bus electrification. So, and we knew from the Infrastructure Act that had gotten attention and certainly a lot of new money. But with the Infrastructure Act, with a $40,000 target placed right on vehicles over 14,000 pounds, which obviously incorporates incremental additional money to school buses, incremental additional money to transit agencies, incremental additional money to work trucks, very exciting to us. I was very pleased and surprised to see it, but pleasantly surprised.
You mentioned the Infrastructure Act, and there was a lot of talk in planning and national news that went into that. I don't remember seeing much in regards to national headlines about the Inflation Reduction Act.
I didn't either. No, you and I have talked about it, but you didn't miss a thing. And I was shocked by it because you're right. The Infrastructure Act, we had 3 or 4 months to think about it, prepare for it. We saw news every day about it and discussions and et cetera. This thing just popped out.
Yeah.
and not only popped out, but popped out with a variety of pieces of the legislation that none of us had thought about, to the extent which it took us several weeks after it came out to really begin to study it and understand what was there and understand the nuances and the subtleties to this that none of us had counted on. So it absolutely is it came out refreshingly fast.
You mentioned some of the numbers and some of that's in this bill, and we'll get to that. But how big is this bill for Lightning e-motors and also for the electric motor vehicle manufacturing market in the commercial side?
Yeah, so I think this is the first time, the Infrastructure Act laid some foundation, but one of the challenges we've all had is there's been a long-standing, with both passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles, a long-standing chicken and egg problem that we've needed to get the costs down to drive the volumes up. And we've needed to get volumes up to drive the costs down. And so for the last 10 years, everybody in the commercial vehicle business has been in a bit of a stagnation around that really we were just focusing on low volume early adopters, and nobody's been able to get past the low volume stage into something that was higher volume, higher quality, lower cost. And those are all things needed to then drive the adoption and create the snowball, and the snowball growing as it goes down the hill. So the Infrastructure Act was step one of that in creating over $5 billion for school buses and $5 billion for transit buses. But it did leave work trucks stranded. There wasn't enough there, in my opinion, around infrastructure. And so this Inflation Reduction Act really, to me, created the rest of what needed to happen to make this thing go. I use analogies. One of my favorite analogies is looking back to digital music, and you think about, if you had an Apple iPod and there were no earphones at the time, or there was no digital music at the time, having an Apple iPod, it wasn't going to be highly adopted. And the same way with the rest of the ecosystem, if you have digital music and no way to play it, you don't get adoption. Yeah. So every industry that has really passed an inflection point requires the rest of the ecosystem to come along in parallel or in front. And so to now be talking about charging and microgrid infrastructure and everything in the Inflation Reduction Act that supports and sponsors more microgrid and more charging and infrastructure, in addition to what's already out there on school buses with the Infrastructure Act. So to me, this was what was needed. This was the icing so that people would eat the cake. This was, yes, the cake was nice, but we still had a very limited uptake on it, and now we've got some real excitement around it. So we needed this to drive it. And some of the examples I use, if you look at a school bus and you say, hey, it was really close with the EPA infrastructure money to, making great sense compared to a diesel, but it wasn't quite there. Now you add another $40,000 of incentive to it. It pushes it over the top. And now you add additional charging, funding, and infrastructure incentive, and it pushes it over the top. The same thing on transit buses. And then you add to that, hey, we've got some state money like California's HVIP program and Colorado's program and California or in New York's program. So we need all of that to really now push the inflection point. And to me, this Inflation Reduction Act created the final inflection point. And we now see, kind of thinking about pictorially rolling that snowball, the snowball, pushing it over the top of the hill. We've now, to me, the Inflation Reduction Act, we're now at the top of the hill pushing it down. And now we start to feel it collecting snow and getting bigger and bigger on its own, rather than us all having to push with such might. So I'm very excited about it because I do see it as that, we've gotten over the hill now. And that's what
you mentioned $5 billion in the Infrastructure Act. That seems kind of like a small number compared to the Inflation Reduction Act's $500 billion. Is that kind of what you think about that snowballing effect and moving forward?
Yes, absolutely, Colin. And I think the other part to that is the breadth of the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's, the Infrastructure Act focused in two areas that Lightning's focused on, school buses and transit agencies, which were important. $5 billion each is good money. Mm-hmm. But it was missing some of the rest of the ecosystem. So back to my analogy, a bit like talking about, hey, we've got iPods, but we have no earphones. We've got iPods and we have no digital music. So who's buying an iPod? 15 years ago. Now we're thinking the same way today. That we got a good start with the Infrastructure Act, but the very significant order of magnitude with Inflation Reduction Act means that we now have charging systems and money for chargers. We're talking about now chargers, every 50 50 miles, I think, is what's mandated in the Inflation Reduction Act. So even though in commercial vehicles we think about depot charging, the ability for these commercial vehicles to know they've got a backup plan that they can, in many cases, publicly charge is huge. And just to create one of the things as we look back over many other industries that kind of start out burgeoning in, when I think about, for example, IT and IT software, some of that started from consumers getting home computers and saying, I want a word processor, and now them coming into the office and saying, I want the latest software. And so we see the same thing happening as more people get electric cars and they can charge those electric cars. They come into work and say, why don't I have an electric bus? Why don't I have an electric work truck? So all of this is part of this real large, kind of grassroots coming up. And so the order of magnitude that you point out is huge. And I think that's a big part of why we see this inflection point.
You've heard me say it before on many calls, I think, and we have the capacity at Lightning to produce a large number of vehicles. If there's no place for them to charge on the road, we're not going to do anything.
Exactly.
And so I think that analogy is super spot on with the digital media. Without having the ability to play it, what does it benefit, right?
Yeah.
So let's get into a little bit more about what our actual customers can maybe take advantage of. So I've seen, and almost all of our vehicles at Lightning qualify for this. Correct.
So we've been fortunate enough that we'd always been, as you pointed out in our intro, a Made in America product. And so the fact that we already meet the Buy America requirements, and we've needed to meet the Buy America requirements, for example, for the Federal Transit Authority infrastructure money. So we've already designed and planned to that. So today, all of our vehicles today meet that Buy America requirement for FTA, Federal Transit Authority money, and therefore we also meet it for the Inflation Reduction Act. The other subtlety of all of this that is kind of playing itself out still, Colin, you and I have spent a lot of time reading the bill, and there's a lot of references to another section and then references to a different section, so it's a complex bill to read. So we've not only studied it ourselves, but then relied on outside counsel who has expertise in this space, relied on some of our inside legal counsel here, and then also gotten information and asked Senator Hickenlooper for his office for their feedback. And we've gotten a couple convergence there. One of them is that for our vehicles, the mineral sourcing requirements for batteries does not apply for a 14,000-pound or larger vehicle, which is a big deal because today, as we know, that U.S.-based mineral sourcing is a challenge for everybody, passenger car or otherwise, and it's going to take a little bit to develop the in-country sourcing for battery minerals. So we immediately, because we don't fall under that, do not have that constraint, and everybody else does, and all the smaller vehicles do. So anybody who's building, something like the smaller Class 2 vehicles, like an E-Transit, like a Bright Drop, Rivian's product that they built for Amazon, all of those are under 10,000 pounds. So they're a long ways away from the 14,000 pound requirement to get the $40,000. Mm-hmm. And they're also, because they are in the smaller requirement, they also, from our reading of an interpretation today, do fall under the battery mineral sourcing requirement. So we're very pleased that what we have today applies for the $40,000 credit. The other one, Colin, you and I have talked a lot about is what about people who are non-taxable?
Right.
And so we also, spent some time looking at the interpretation. In fact, there is a very specific answer there that even non-taxable entities can apply for their $40,000 direct in terms of a cash rebate, if I understand your interpretation.
So they get it cash rebate versus a tax incentive.
Which is nice because it can happen quicker in theory. Yeah. So that obviously for a commercial entity that is taxable, they've got to wait, if I understand it correctly, Colin, until they apply for their taxes to get that $40,000. Whereas a non-taxable entity like a school, like a transit agency, as a municipality, a state agency who's trying to electrify their fleet, they don't have to wait as long to get their $40,000 back.
That can be really exciting for some of these transit agencies that are really trying to move forward quickly, and especially for some of the rural transit agencies that have a smaller budget, much smaller budget, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And there's obviously quite a push when you look at Colorado's Clean Fleet Enterprise grant money, and you look at even what California is trying to do, even beyond HVIP. There's a push to help some of these rural agencies get started. Now, I've been an advocate that, yes, let's get started, but let's not start too slow because of this ecosystem challenge, we want to see people buy 10 at a time to make sure we can get the critical mass and the cost downs around charging and infrastructure and microgrid. So the rest of the story. So to me, this extra, IRA money, the infrastructure money, really provides the necessary budget for these smaller school districts to buy in mass, to buy 10 school buses or 10 shuttle buses or 10 transit agency buses or 10 work trucks, utility trucks for their city's utility company, et cetera. So that's the other real thing that I think has happened with the IRA is it's providing enough money there to even pick up the rural districts.
This leads to a interesting question that I have in terms of, we know there's $40,000 in this IRA money, and then there's this whole field of other pockets of money. In your opinion, can these be used? We use the term stackable, but can they just be used in conjunction with each other? Does it seem like?
We've done a lot of studying, and obviously there are different programs that have different requirements, but so far the majority of the big programs we participate in do today specifically state they allow stacking. So, and again, Colin, this is where you spend your days and nights, so I rely heavily on you and our legal team to make sure we're given what we know. But what I've been informed, and as we've read through, that certainly California's programs allow in many cases a stackable scenario. So does Colorado's Clean Fleet product that program that's on the verge here. So does New York's that one's called TVIP, if I recall.
Something along and New York Zip or New York Vib or
yes, there's a lot of different acronyms that we'll throw out, but the states have been conscious to allow people to use a combination of money, and again that is important because in many of these cases today, most electric vehicles, and we know this has been true, it's been widely touted that even electric passenger vehicles, today are still represent a significant premium because batteries are significantly more expensive than a aluminum fuel tank. So from that connection, it's very clear that for a significant period of time, electric vehicles up front will be more expensive.
Up front.
Yes.
Up front.
Exactly, up front. But ongoing, we generally see, some of the numbers we use, 85% lower operating cost. Yep. So dramatic, and especially since fuel prices have been up and have maintained, they aren't quite as high as their peak, but they're still dramatically higher than they were a year and a half ago. As people look at the operating costs, not just fuel costs, but brake savings, et cetera, very dramatic reduction in operating costs, no oil changes like we've talked about. So given those operating cost savings, there is when companies and corporations and municipalities and cities and states can take advantage of the upfront cost reduction to make it more parity with where their budget had been for a diesel or gasoline vehicle, and now they also then going forward experience a significant operating cost reduction. This is great for the taxpayer. It's great for the general public, not to mention obviously the air quality improvements and human health improvements and carbon improvements and climate change improvements. So I'm excited about that, but it's a big part of why we see this stacking that we're talking about being a game changer.
And one thing that I received clarification on earlier, and we've talked about this in the past, but I don't think I've mentioned this to you that I received clarification on it, is the EPA will allow stacking of this into their clean school bus initiative.
Oh, that's outstanding.
Which could potentially lead to, my thinking is, if you maximize all funding sources, potentially free school buses in some districts, which, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, and it is very much, not to overuse the statement, but it's a game changer for these schools because we all know the schools have limited budgets. Mm-hmm. It's difficult for a school to go raise taxes and look for more school bus money. But when you look at this and say not only can they save what they originally had in the budget, get more school buses, which is especially important because many of them had stalled buying buses during COVID. And so they're short buses, their buses have been aging. Their buses, if you have an old diesel bus, it costs a lot of money typically to keep that bus on the road in terms of maintenance and service and fuel costs. So to be able to replace that old diesel bus with now an electric bus that is almost nearly free in many cases, but even if it's not free, if you look at the average of those new buses across your fleet, it's still now less than replacing it with a diesel bus. And now moving forward, you have 80% less cost to manage and maintain this bus moving forward. And by the way, student health, teacher health, school bus driver health, safety, it all improve as you go to a new fleet. Because keep in mind, not only are we talking about electric vehicles, but in most cases, our electric powertrains have newer safety tech, regenerative braking. We have a lot of additional safety features that schools really care about, transit agencies care about. So this is a tremendous win across many different variables.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time to be here, and that actually leads me to a question of so we talked about the incentives in the IRA, and there's other portions of it that we don't need to get into that don't affect our industry. But in regards to our industry, in the Inflation Reduction Act, is there anything else that's not necessarily customer-based incentives, maybe infrastructure money or anything like that you think might actually be excitable for Lightning as a company?
Yeah, so obviously we are a manufacturing entity, and we are deep studying some of the new incentives around U.S. manufacturing that are there. We are constantly looking at make versus buy. What do we decide to bring in-house in terms of what we make here versus what we buy? And so there's a variety of new funding and incentives and loan programs, some of those flowing through DOE, that I'm, at least on initial read, I think can be very applicable to us and certainly help us fund moving more things today that we might buy externally or might buy, import from other countries and now be able to make it here with U.S. labor and Buy America standards. So we think there's other things in this Inflation Reduction Act from a manufacturing that are very interesting and applicable. And then also looking at it from the infrastructure side. As most people know, we have offerings around the energy side. And this is not just charging. Mm-hmm. So obviously we sell chargers, both some that we make, like our mobile battery vehicle charger, and some that we buy and white label. In both of those cases, there is additional money here to support growing that business. And like we've talked about in this call, infrastructure has been a major impediment. The lack of infrastructure, when you think about a rural school district, how are they going to charge 10 buses or 20 buses or 50 buses? It's a big challenge, and it hasn't been solved previously, and it takes money to solve. And it's not just about getting a charger. It's also about getting the charger installed. So there's money in this bill that talks about workforce training and talks about how do we get enough electricians to do this kind of work, both rural and in the big cities. And there's also money to talk about how do we handle the grid situation, because in some cases the utilities aren't readily available. I read today from one of the DC fast charge groups that are bottlenecks around transformers and utility company transformers. So we're working with one of our key partners, BP, to talk about bringing in microgrids that don't rely on the utility companies to provide the electricity for these chargers. So the amount of money in the infrastructure bill frees up and solves a lot of these ancillary issues that are absolutely critical to big rollout. So when we think about school buses today, there's typically every year outside of COVID about 30,000 big school buses sold a year and about 10,000 smaller school buses. So smaller school buses in a Type A, bigger school buses in a Type C. That's a lot of school buses. And now we say, hey, post-COVID, there's a little bit of backlog there of these buses that have aged and need to be replaced after the last 3 years of less replacement. In order to do that and do this at a fast pace and go electric, we not only need the incentive to help those schools with their budget, we also need to be able to help them solve how are we going to charge them, where's the electricity coming from, how are we going to get chargers installed. And so a lot of times that's been understated that, hey, it seems easy. It's not. In the same way, though, that it wasn't easy when schools started running buses back in the 1930s when you had quite a population of school buses starting to run. They didn't have gas gas stations
No.
and diesel stations back then.
Yeah.
And many schools had to go get a diesel tank or figure out how they were going to fuel them. And there weren't spare tires and there weren't mechanics. And so this is not new. It is, been nearly 100 years since we've had to go through this kind of change, but it's solvable. And having this, the $500 billion here in Inflation Reduction Act makes a huge difference in solving the broader scope of these issues to make sure we can quickly push forward on this.
Yeah, and I was really excited to see some of those things that you just mentioned are either going to be fully funded or fully refundable to manufacturers and grid installers and that sort of thing. They really thought about that aspect in this bill. And I think that's because in our market and around the nation with many of the thought leaders, we've come to an understanding that the electric motor vehicle market is here. It's the future. Do you feel that this bill might help solidify that in the public's mindset as well?
Yes, because I think, I follow a lot of the various social media, and you still see some social media, people pull out, 10-year-old arguments of, hey, there's not enough charging. Well, that, as we've talked about here, that is true. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to solve the charging problem, and this puts enough money to solve it, because one of the problems we've all had is just throwing a little bit of money at problem. If you don't really as my analogy earlier, get the snowball over the hill, yep. It doesn't push itself. It doesn't now start to self-build. And we had to get there, and I think this bill puts enough money to really get it there, and it puts enough money for the public to say, hey, we're serious, and there's now enough money, and this is going to happen, rather than continue to second guess, hey, if you don't get enough charging, it's not going to happen. Hey, if you don't solve the budget problem that schools have, where they can't, even though a school can look at a 10-year plan and say, hey, an electric school bus is cheaper over 10 years, their budget is still old school, meaning their budget is set up for a high capital or a low capital expense, buying an inexpensive diesel or petrol or gasoline bus, and then over time spending a lot of money on maintenance and fuel and brakes and oil changes. Now we need to flip their budget, and that budget can't be flipped overnight.
No.
So we solve that by the various incentive programs that we have now, and that allows the schools time to flip their budget and look at this differently, which is great. And so I think the public can look out and say, hey, there's enough will at the government and enough money at the government that even though, yes, some of these problems we point out are legitimate, there's now enough money to get past those problems and solve this problem. So I think the other thing that's happening is there's enough will, meaning when we look at some of the fleet managers, even older school fleet managers who are skeptical, and rightfully so skeptical about this, many of them look at this as an opportunity to now say, okay, this is going to happen, so I'd better get on board. I was listening to I was actually in a room with a panel of Federal Transit Authority people who were running some of the biggest transit agencies on the West Coast, and I remember two of the people on the panel said, we now realize, they said over the last 3 years we've been skeptical, we fought it, we've debated it, we'd stand up here on this panel and say, if electrification happens. Mm-hmm. They said, today you're going to hear us all say, not if, but when.
Right.
It is happening. This is no longer an if, it's no longer a maybe. It has happened. It is happening. We're required by, the state of California in this case to have, our plan in place for how every one of our transit agency vehicles will be electric. And so that was an interesting change where the fleet managers who maybe were skeptical or even, in some way fighting this change because it represented significant challenge, have now said, hey, some of those hurdles have been solved, so we're ready to get on board. And I'm seeing them wholesale get on board. So, yes, obviously we're always worried about public perception, but beyond public perception, you need the decision makers at schools and school buses and city councils to get on board, and they are. And we needed, the same thing on the transit agencies and work trucks. And so I do think this provides the inflection point and the change where everybody can say, okay, we're committed.
So I think from what I'm hearing from you is the future in this country seems to be we're moving forward, seems to be on the right track, and a pretty bright future for the electric motor vehicle manufacturing companies.
I believe so, and I think you look, I've been to China several times, and they they're ahead of us doing this, meaning their government's been putting very significant subsidy money towards the electrification effort for much longer than we have, and it has worked, meaning they have transitioned a significant number of their commercial vehicles to electric very successfully, and certainly that's another thing that helps us. We leverage some of what comes out of the learnings that China had, technically technically, but also, I think politically in terms of how do you, what does the government have to do to really ensure that, a society can make some of these deep changes that are the right thing for people to do, but you've got to have help on the broad ecosystem and infrastructure side to make it happen, and it's happening now.
Well, thank you very much for today. I think this was very insightful for me and also for our listeners, and hopefully we can help fund our customers to take advantage of this money.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin.